Likutei Sichos, Chelek Tes Zayin, the Sicha of Mishpatim base, second Sicha of Mishpatim. This Sicha is on the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim. Kisikne Eved Ivri, when you buy a Eved Ivri, a servant Ivri, and Rashi quotes the word as follows. Rashi says, Kisikne Eved Ivri. Let me get the Rashi open here. Yeah, says Rashi. Kisik neved ivri. Rashi quotes in his heading. Kisikne eved ivri. When you will buy an eved ivri, says Rashi. Eved shuhu ivri. This is referring to a servant who is a Jewish servant, or continues Rashi, or perhaps you mean to say a servant who belongs to an Ivri, to a Jew, but who's really what's called an Eved Kanani, a Canaanite Eved. A Canaanite Eved would be an Eved slave that was captured or purchased from one of the other nations, not a fellow Jew. So perhaps when the pasuk says "Ki tikna," when you buy an eved ivri, it's not a servant who's a Jew, but rather you're buying the servant of a Jew, the non-Jewish servant from another Jew. And about this, the pasuk says that for 6 years he should work, and on the 7th year he goes free. He says Rashi, what will I do with the pasuk that says that your servants are something that you pass on even in your inheritance to your children? If in other words, usually we understood simply that servants that are not Jewish become passed on as an inheritance. Servants that are Jewish will get let out in the 7th year, so they don't become property that gets transmitted as an inheritance to the next generation. Says Rashi, so if this pasuk is saying when you buy yourself an eved, a servant, a non-Jewish servant from a Jew, you should let him out on the 7th year. Says Rashi, well then what will I do? The pasuk later on in the Torah that says that your servants should be passed on as an inheritance to your children. Says Rashi, I would have said that that's when you bought a non-Jewish servant from a non-Jew. But if you bought a non-Jewish servant from a Jew, maybe that's what our parsha here is saying. You should let him out on the 6th year. Comes the pasuk and says that no. Elsewhere the pasuk says ki yamuch achicha. Elsewhere the pasuk says ki macher lecha achicha ha'ivri. Later on, Devarim pasuk says ki macher lecha achicha ha'ivri, when your brother, the Jewish person, is sold to you, so you have a Jewish servant, you let him out on the 7th year. So in other words, just to clarify a little bit, the pasuk says when you buy an Eved Ivri, he works for 6 years, he gets let out in the 7th year. Says Rashi, we're talking here about a servant who is an Ivri, a servant who is a Jew. Works 6 years, let him out 7th year. Maybe you'd want to say we're talking about a servant who is a non-Jew bought from a Jew, and therefore we'll say there's 2 qualifications in non-Jewish slaves. One is that's brought from a fellow Jew, and you send him out 6th year. One is bought from a non-Jew, and that he becomes a permanent slave, and he even becomes inherited by the next generation. That's what I may have wanted to say. So there's another pasuk that says, no, this law of 6th year, 7th year being released applies to Jewish servants. Okay, the Eved is actually an Ivri, not, you see the word Eved Ivri, let's say, Eved means servant, Ivri means Jewish. Does it mean the servant of a Jew or a Jewish servant? Right, that's what Rashi is saying. So Rashi qualifies, no, it means a Jewish servant. Okay, now we have to understand, says the Rebbe, 2 questions. First question is, this pirush is to explain the word Eved Ivri. It explains it's not the servant of an Ivri, it's a servant who is an Ivri, who's a Jew. So why does Rashi also bring the words ki tikne? And when you buy, and the Rebbe, as a parenthetical note here, that really Rashi brought here, what does it mean when you buy an Eved Ivri? How can you buy an Eved Ivri? So Rashi says, in this case, we're talking where a person had stolen and he's not able to pay for his theft. So the Beis Din sells him in order to recoup the money that he owes the person he sold from. So let's say he stole something, and he owes a large amount of money. He doesn't have the money to pay, so the Beis Din will sell him to be able to pay his restitution, to pay what he has stolen. Maybe it means he sold himself because he's destitute. No, but then we already have another pasuk that tells us that. So really, this kitikna is telling us something else. Kitikna is when you buy an Eved Ivri, how is it that you bought an Eved Ivri? Well, he was sold by the Beis Din. But that's really only once we know that we're talking about a Jewish servant. So the question is, how do you ever get to buy a Jewish servant? And there's only one of two ways. This way we're talking about in our parsha is if he stole and he didn't have enough money to pay back. At any rate, the question is though, let's leave it simple. I think in the actual sikha here, this is a paragraph that's nuanced. It's a little pilpully. How do you say in English? Pilpully. It's a little tricky. So let's just leave the question. The first question is, if Rashi is explaining that just the classification that it's not a slave, it's not the servant of a Jew, rather it's a Jewish servant. Don't bring the words kitikna when you buy. What's that relevant? That's part of the dibra masal. That's part of the heading. Why is that needed to be part of the heading? Just say the heading Eved Ivri. Question number two: how could I even think? Why would Rashi say that we would think it's a servant of a Jew? You're buying a non-Jewish servant from a Jew. It seems so clear to say that the word Eved Ivri means a Jewish servant, right? We have several precedents for this in the Torah. First of all, it says about Yosef, there was with us a Nar Ivri. Nar Ivri means a Jewish lad. When they were telling about Yosef being in prison, a Nar Ivri. And there's another place in Navi where it says about an Eved Mitzri, that the Eved was a Mitzri, was an Egyptian servant, not a servant of an Egyptian. Similarly, there's another pasuk in Shmuel, Eved Leish Amaleki, a servant to an Amalek, an Amaleki. So in other words, which tells you the reverse. When the pasuk wants to say it's a servant of an Amalek, of an Amalekite, so it says it Eved Leish Amaleki. It doesn't say Eved Amaleki, which would tell us if it says Eved Amaleki, would have meant an Amalekite servant. In order to say it's a servant of an Amalekite, it has to say Eved Leish Amaleki, which means to tell us basically that when it says Eved Ivri, why would Rashi even entertain anything different than his initial statement that it's a Jewish servant? Why would Rashi say, you may think it's a servant that belongs to a Jew, a non-Jewish servant that you're buying from a Jew? Why would I think that? In the footnotes, the Rabbi brings something fascinating, that take the example when we say Eved Hashem. What does Eved Hashem mean? The servant of Hashem, right? So in that case, Eved Ivri would be the servant of the Ivri. The Rebbe says, no, you can't compare the two. When it says Eved, Eved means the servant, and then it says the name of a person afterwards. You understand it's the servant of that person. Like Eliezer was Eved Avraham, the servant of Avraham. When, however, there's a different, when it's not said in that way, when it's said Eved Ivri, we understand it's that the Eved, the Ivri is going on the Eved, that the servant is an Ivri servant. So, again, why does Rashi even bring a question on his initial pshat, that it's a servant who is a Ivri? Some of Farshim say that the reason for Rashi saying maybe you would think it's talking about a non-Jewish servant, an Eved of an Ivri, a servant you bought off an Ivri, is because it says Kitikne Eved Ivri. He's already been called an Eved. It doesn't say when you buy somebody and you make him your servant. When you buy an Ivri, you make him your servant. It says when you buy an Eved Ivri, that sounds he's already an Eved. The only way you can buy somebody who's already an Eved is if it's a non-Jew who has the classification of Eved, of servant, and you're buying him from another Jew. So that would seem to fit with the concept of the Eved is an Eved of an Ivri. It's a servant of a fellow Jew. Um, However, that's not enough of a reason for Rashi to entertain that perhaps it's talking here about a non-Jewish servant that you're buying from a Jew. Why? Because in the simple reading of the pasuk, it's more simple to say that you're buying. Um, if that was the simple meaning of the pasuk, then Rashi should have started it differently. He should have said, "You may think." You see, how did Rashi start? Rashi said, "When you buy an Eved Ivri," Rashi said, "It's an Eved that is an Ivri." And then he says, in case you'll think maybe you're buying an Eved from an Ivri, no, so it's not the case. If, as these other Mefarshim are pointing out, that the words Eved Ivri seem to note that it's already a servant, and so therefore it makes more sense to say you're buying from a Jew, his servant, then Rashi should have started, if Rashi felt that way, he would have started his interpretation right away with projecting Eved Ivri. You may think that this is buying a servant from another Ivri. It's already a servant, a non-Jewish servant, and you're buying it from another Ivri. Talmud Laima, so we have another pasuk that tells us no. But from the fact that Rashi right away jumps in and says, this is clearly an Eved who is an Ivri, an Eved who is a Jew, from this we understand that Rashi's simplest meaning, simplest understanding here is that the Eved is actually the Ivri. You want to perhaps know, so why is he indeed called an Eved? So the Rebbe in the footnote brings quotes, I believe, the several people that comment on it. I think that I wonder if not here, maybe it's a little later on, that why is he already called an Eved? Yeah, the Rebbe elsewhere, I think, L'Nesicha quotes that we're already calling him an Eved because the circumstance in which, remember, we said why is he becoming a servant? Because he's stolen, he doesn't have enough money to pay, so he's already has a certain servitude imprinted on him. He owes money, he's not able to pay. So you're buying already somebody who's kind of enslaved. But that's okay. Leave that as it is. So that's the second. That is the second question. Why would I think it's not the way Rashi just says simply a Jewish Eved? Third question is, why does Rashi have to ask here a question from Devarim, which says, right? Rashi says it's an Eved that's an Ivri, an Eved that's Jewish, and he says because if I don't say that, right? And if I say that this is an Eved that you bought from an Ivri, an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish Eved that you bought from a Jew, and we're telling you to, this is a possibility, and we're telling you to leave him go in on the 7th year, what would I then do with a pasuk that says that non-Jewish servants get transferred onwards as an inheritance? Why does Rashi even go there? Why would the 5-year-old have a question from later on in the Chumash? She doesn't know yet about this law that the Eved gets transferred onward as an inheritance. So why does he even have to bring it? True, says the Rebbe, it's in the Mechilta it brings it, but Rashi doesn't have to bring everything from the Medrash. He quotes things that are relevant to understand for a 5-year-old. So that's why we have to, it must be that this whole Pirush has meaning, bringing in this question has meaning of Isnachaltem. What does it mean then that to ask the question about the transferal of the servants as an inheritance, there must be a reason it needs to be raised here. So as we're going to explain. Okay, that's chapter 1 of the Sikha. Basically, we want to understand why Kitikna, why the Dibra Maskal, the heading of Rashi also brings the words when you buy. What's that got to do? He's just explaining Eved Ivri. We want to understand why Rashi even brings the entertainment of the thought that it's not an Eved Ivri, but it's an Eved that you're buying from an Ivri. Why would we even think that? Why does he have to talk about that? And why does he bring in the question from Vihis Nachal? Chapter 2, the explanation is like this. This is the Rebbe gives us a perspective that puts a whole new light into this. L'chaim. So, paragraph 2. The explanation is, it says earlier in the pasuk, when when the Bnei Yisrael, it says earlier in the description of the Exodus of going out of Egypt, that the Bnei Yisrael took with them a lot of gold and silver vessels. And when they were at the sea, at the Yam Suf, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu had to force them to leave because they were so busy collecting all the other spoil and booty that were there. There was the Egyptians, when they came to pursue them, they had adorned themselves and their horses with jewelry and gold and silver and precious stones. And the Bnei Yisrael found that they had even more to collect in terms of wealth at the sea than they took out with them outside of Egypt. So everybody was very, very wealthy, which was not the case when this was not the case really with them. Yeah, right? They became very wealthy. From this, we can understand that with such wealth, you couldn't have a Jewish servant. How would a Jew become a slave or a servant to another Jew? That's so much money. Why does somebody become a servant? Because either he stole and he can't pay, or he lost. He's run out of money, so he has to sell himself. Right? Those are the two options how a Jew can become a servant to another Jew. But hey, they were so rich when they left Egypt, from the money they took out of Egypt and the money at the sea. Interesting, you may not know this, but the Rebbe brings in a footnote a Gemara Yerushalmi that says actually the Jews were instructed in Egypt to free their brethren who were slaves to them. Jewish people had servants. I guess there were different tiers of society within the Jewish enslavement in Egypt. The Jews themselves also had servants, and they were instructed by Yitzavim el Bnei Yisrael. It's hinted to only in the pasuk in Boy that Hashem instructed them to release their servants within them, and this was a prelude to going out of the Golus, to going out of the exile of Egypt. The Jews had to redeem their brethren that were servants to them, and that was an introduction, and that was a preparatory step for then the Jews to actually be redeemed from Egypt. That's an interesting thing that the Rebbe quotes from the Yerushalmi. But at this stage, they've sent away, even if they had Jewish servants, they sent them away. Even if they hadn't sent them away, they would definitely be able to go and get the money and buy themselves out, redeem themselves, right? So how could you have a servant, an Eved Ivri? How could you have a Jew who's a servant? The Rebbe in a footnote says, well, maybe we've learned in the Ten Commandments about leisachmid, not to covet. It's possible that somebody has a lot of money but desires more and then steals, and maybe then would have to be sold as a servant. But says the Rebbe, but then it's highly ludicrous to think that he's able to steal, and even there are some punishments you have to pay a penalty of up to 5 times more the value of what you stole. If you stole an ox or a sheep, 4 or 5 times the value you have to pay as a penalty. But still, if they were so fabulously wealthy, they were able to pay it. They wouldn't have had to become slaves to each other. Since this pasuk ve'ela Mishpatim is coming right on the heels of the giving of the Torah, which is right after they left Egypt and the splitting of the sea. So one would think that first Hashem should tell them mitzvahs that are relevant to their current status. Indeed, the Torah does say, don't make images and gods of silver and gold. Now that's something important to tell them when they got out of Egypt, because they had they had a lot of wealth. Don't get caught up into idolatry. And tell them to make the way to make the Mizbeach, make it out of, the Mizbeach has to be made out of earth, out of stones, perhaps telling them, don't make it out of gold, don't make it out of silver, because they had so much silver and gold. He had to tell them, don't make deities of silver and gold. On the other hand, the Mizbeach, even though you're so wealthy, that has to be out of earth and stones. So therefore, why is Hashem telling them this law about servants here? So Rashi, when he brings so that's why Rashi says, look, this law is definitely talking about Eved Shehu Ivri. It's talking about a servant who is Jewish. But because this is against in the context of them being so wealthy. Rashi says, you may think, wow, if this is being taught here when they're so wealthy, maybe you'll think it can't be. It's not talking about a Jewish servant. Maybe it's talking about a non-Jewish servant that they bought from a fellow Jew, and that's what would seem to fit better into the context of them, of the wealthy people getting an instruction. That's something you would tell a wealthy person. Each Jew is wealthy independently, so there's no Jewish servants, but perhaps servants you bought from a Jew, because they did have servants and maidservants, not fellow Jews, but they had others. Where would they have gotten from? So in the footnote, the Rebbe points out, where would they have had servants from? Well, they wouldn't have had it from Egypt. We didn't find that they took out Egyptian slaves with them. But we do know that they had access to peddlers, to all kinds of business people that would visit them in the desert. This is a figure. If you had something to sell, you hear there's a few million people walking around the desert, you'd go and try and peddle your wares to them, right? So they were able, the Gemara speaks that many things that we don't know, how did they get in the desert? Oh, they got it from the peddling businessmen that would come and visit them, salesmen. So they could also have gotten maids and servants, servants and maidservants there. And that's so we would understand, in other words, that it would make more sense for this mitzvah that's told to them in the context of them being wealthy to talk about non-Jewish servants, right? And by the way, in the Aseres Adibris, it says on Shabbos you can't work, you or your servants or your maidservants. So we already see that Hashem has addressed them with as being owners of servants. So that's why Rashi says, look, clearly this pasuk is talking about an Eved Ivri, that the servant is a Jew. But I know what's bothering you. Jewish servant, how would that be? So that's why Rashi says, you may think we're talking about a non-Jewish servant that's being bought from a fellow Jew. She says, no, I'm proving to you from the verses, that's not what we're talking about here. Okay. Chapter 3. By a 5-year-old, however, we're going to have a question. What's the question? We learned earlier that Avraham Avinu had a servant for many years. His name was Eliezer, a very trusted servant. From before the Bris Ben Abisarim, from before the covenant between the parts, and all the way to be making a shidduch for Yitzchak. We find that Avraham Avinu sent him to find Rivka for his son Yitzchak, which tells us that he was a servant for more than 50 years. Because Avraham Avinu was 70 years old at the covenant of the parts, between the parts, and Yitzchak got married 70 years after that, right? Because Yitzchak was born to Avraham when he was 100, and he married Rivka when he was 40. So you're talking about 70 years at least, at least 70 years that he was a servant. So the question is, we know that Avraham Avinu and all the forefathers kept all the Torah the way even before it was given. So how did Avraham Avinu keep Eliezer for so long as a servant? Yeah. Why didn't he send him away after 6 years? In other words, when Rashi entertains the Havamin, it's called, the hypothesis that perhaps we're talking here about a non-Jewish servant that you're buying from a fellow Jew, and then there's a mitzvah to send him away after 6 years. So then Rashi needs to bring in a question, because at this stage, the 5-year-old says, 1 second, how can we say that even a non-Jewish slave would need to be redeemed freed after 6 years? What about Eliezer? So instead of bringing a question about Eliezer, what we say about Eliezer, Rashi brings from indeed the halacha we know that slavery continues even as an inheritance, continues forever. Right? There's no freeing a slave who's not an Ivri. And so he asks from the pasuk, instead of asking from Avraham, Yes, from a pasuk. How could we even think that this is talking about a non-Jewish servant that's being bought from a Jew, and we're saying to redeem him on the 7th year? What about the pasuk that says you should keep him, and even that's even passes on as an inheritance to your children, the servant? So he says, no, that would be that would be when you bought him from a non-Jew, which was the case of Avram. So that Avram bought Eliezer from another non-Jew. He didn't buy him from another Jew, which would tell us. Um, so that would answer the 5-year-old's question. That's why Rashi has to bring in a question which is from a later pasuk, but it's not the question doesn't start from the pasuk. The question starts in the 5-year-old's mind from Avram Avinu that he knows about, who had a servant for more than 70 years and didn't redeem him and didn't free him. So that's why that question arises. So Rashi, when he gives the possibility, you may think that this is talking about a servant that you buy, a non-Jewish servant that you buy from a Jew, and we have to send him away after 6 years. You'll ask, what about Avram? He kept the servant for 70 years, but Rashi doesn't say Avram. You'll ask, the pasuk says that that a non-Jewish servant goes forever, even goes as an inheritance, is inherited by the next generation. How are you going to learn that if this pasuk is saying that a non-Jewish servant is also sent after 7 years? That we would have been able to establish that differently. That would be there's two kinds of non-Jewish servants. One that's bought from a fellow Jew because he's and the rationale for that in one of the footnotes, Rabbi brings a commentary that says because he was already a non-Jewish servant is already obligated in mitzvahs like a woman. He's obligated in many of the mitzvahs. So you would think if you're buying him from another Jew, so he's already kind of quasi-Jewish. Now you're buying him. Now you'll be responsible to send him away after 6 years. If you bought a non-Jewish servant from a non-Jew, then you keep him forever. That's the hypothetical way of learning it, right? Rashi says, no, this is an Eved Ivri. The law of sending in 6 years, only Eved Ivri, a Jewish servant. Okay, now we understand chapter 4. Now we understand also why Rashi brings the pasuk, the words in his heading, the words of kitikna, when you will buy, because this strengthens his pshat that it's a Jewish servant. In other words, in this by prefacing the words kitikna, when you will buy, what does that tell us? It means when you will buy in the future. And indeed, right now you don't have this. Right now you can't have it. Everybody's too wealthy to have an Eved Ivri, to have a Jewish servant. It's not really feasible because the guy who would be the servant is himself wealthy, so he's not going to be a servant. So that's why Rashi brings the pasuk kitikna, that we're talking about something futuristic. When you guys will already, the kind of the wheel of fortune will turn, and there'll already be Jews that are not so wealthy, and they may. Then, if you buy a Jewish servant, you have to send him away on after 6 years. And this helps strengthen the pshat that we're talking here, taka, about an Eved Ivri. We're talking about a Jewish servant, and it's just a futuristic thing. Taka, it's not. You may think we're talking about a non-Jewish servant that you bought from a fellow Jew because how could there be Jewish servants right now when everybody's so wealthy? Taka. That's what Rashi puts in the heading. Ki tikna. This is a futuristic thing. It will become relevant. Right now, it's not so relevant. It will become relevant one day. Will be something of norm one day. Chapter 5, according to this, however, we don't understand. Why would the Torah Taka start with the law of Eved Ivri, if so? It was something unusual, as we said. People were wealthy. Why wouldn't it start with something more frequent? This is the first parsha after the giving of the Torah. Say something that's more down to earth, that's more practical, that's more day to day. This is something ki tikna. When in the future you'll have a reversal, or the fortunes will become more jaded, and then you can have a servant, a Jewish servant. Why don't you say something more relevant? Especially that, what did we say? How can you become a Jewish servant if somebody stole and wasn't able to pay? We haven't yet said really the laws of stealing. This happens later in our parsha. We talk about it. If somebody steals, and sometimes you have to pay double, there's a penalty. Sometimes you pay 4 and 5 times, and that will mean all of a sudden a guy Nebuch went to steal something, and he's going to have to pay 4 or 5 times the price. Like the Torah gives a penalty in a sheep or a bull. So then he may have no money. He's going to have to be sold into becoming a servant for 6 years, right? We weren't told these laws yet. So why are we jumping straight into saying something, talking about the laws of a Jewish servant, which seem to be not so relevant? And since that's a good question in the eyes of the way the simple reading of the pasuk, and actually all the other simplistic commentaries of the Torah all explain why the Torah started with the laws of an Eved. For example, the Rabbi just alludes to them in the footnotes. For example, Ramban says, because one of the key aspects of the Ten Commandments is the Shabbos, which reminds us of creation, right? The 7-year cycle in the servant also reminds us of the same thing, right? So it's very central. But Rashi doesn't give us any clue as to why these laws were brought right after the giving of the Torah, the laws of the servant. You can't say that, well, for Pshutei Shomik and the simple reading of the pasuk, it's not really a question that he has to answer. You can't really say that because he does. Rashi says, Ve'ela hamishpatim, what does it say? Vav, and these are the laws. It's connected to the previous parsha of Sinai. It says, just like Vav is always adding. It says, just like the first thing you read last parsha, everything was from Sinai, the Ten Commandments. These mitzvahs and mishpatim are also from Sinai. So we see there is a continuation here of the parsha. So why Rashi should explain why we start with the laws of Eved Ivri. So chapter 6. So we could say that Rashi already gives us an insight into why the laws of Avadim, why the laws of Jewish servants are taught here. Rashi gives us an insight a little later on. What happens? Later on, if the servant doesn't want to go free after 7 years, he stays on additional years, right? He stays on till, but before he stays on, if the servant says, I'm going to paraphrase the pasuk. The servant says, I love my master, my wife.